So today we're going to go ahead and talk about FDR and the New Deal. Again, we've already kind of covered and laid the foundation for the Great Depression. What were some of the effects? What were some of the causes? And kind of what were some of the bigger picture when it comes to how did we get into the Great Depression? Well, now we're going to switch and start talking about, well, how do we get out of that depression? And it's predominantly due to FDR's leadership and his New Deal policies, which really gave America the jump start that it needed to climb out of the depression. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Here's the agenda. So we're going to go through a little bit of background on FDR himself, a little bit of background on the New Deal, some New Deal specifics, a brief note on the New Deal coalition, talk about the end of the New Deal, some lasting effects, and then a couple of resources which I recommend you check out to help gain a little bit more clarity about the New Deal as well. So first thing, FDR. So he wins the 1932 presidential election as a Democrat over the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover, who had done a terrible job so far of trying to alleviate some of the negative effects of the Depression. So FDR comes in, he wins about 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 million. A little bit about himself personally. Well, he's the two-term governor of New York and a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. And then this election is kind of like a big turning event. It's a big shift in power where the Democrats not only win the presidency with FDR, but you're winning 2/3 of the Senate and 3/4 of the House in the same election. So that uniform control of all branches of government means that Roosevelt can do exactly what he needs to do to effectively roll out the legislation to combat the Great Depression. So that's a big, big deal when you can control the House, the Senate, and the presidency and get a lot done. A little bit more here. So FDR, he is the first president to really use technology to his advantage in terms of outreach and getting his message across to the American public. At the time, he's using radio like nobody's ever used radio before. Most Americans more or less have a radio, so it's kind of the easiest way to more or less communicate about what the government is doing to alleviate some of the problems that the Great Depression was causing in people's lives. FDR uses what he calls fireside chats, which were basically speeches over the radio to address issues of public concern and to explain clearly what the New Deal agency or measure or policy was going to do to basically help alleviate those concerns and alleviate those issues. The big quote of the time, I'm sure you've heard, is the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A couple other things in terms of his personal life. Well, he's diagnosed with polio in 1921 and becomes paralyzed from the waist down. If you notice, there's not too many photos of him in a wheelchair, and he tried to hide that from the public a lot, but as a result of being paralyzed from the waist down, he's actually able to gain greater compassion for others. And the other interesting note here is FDR was president for 12 years, 1933 to 1945. He wins 4 elections in the process, and this is a big shift to what was kind of a understood precedent where presidents would only, seek 2 terms or be in office for a maximum of 2 terms. There was nothing in the law that prevented them from going for more, but they're following the example set out by George Washington when he famously stepped down after 2 terms, not wanting to be a forever president. But obviously Roosevelt wins 4 terms, and ever since then there has been a law in the books. I forget the amendment specifically, but basically it limits presidential term limits to 2, so you can only win 2 terms nowadays. Other thing about FDR is that he dies in office in 1945 before World War II had ended, and before he could actually complete his 4th term as president. Harry Truman takes over, and he's obviously the famous president who gave the okay to drop the atomic bombs on Japan to end the war in the Pacific, which we'll get to when we talk about World War II. A little bit more background on the New Deal now. So the New Deal, in a broad sense, is a government program designed to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression. All right, it's just basically the really easy name for a large-scale government intervention program designed to really bring America out of the Depression. The name comes from a speech given by FDR where he promised a new deal for the American people. Remember, his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, promised a square deal and a fair deal. Well, now kind of FDR is taking his own twist on that, saying a new deal, a new beginning, new hope, new opportunity for the American people. The big thing here is the three main goals for relief for the needy, economic recovery, and financial reform. Right? Those are the three big prongs of the New Deal. So, during his first 100 days as president, FDR coordinated with the democratically controlled Congress. Remember, they controlled the House and they controlled the Senate to pass 15 pieces of New Deal legislation. Basically, those were the first guiding principles and pieces of legislation that help the government expand their role in the nation's economy in terms of oversight on financial institutions, bank lending, things of that nature. Basically, this is kind of gets the government in the door to really make some big changes, which is ultimately that first phase. They're talking about banking and financial reforms. They need to kind of control the bleeding, stop the bleeding of the economy. So on March 5th, on his first day as president, FDR actually declares a banking holiday and close all the banks to prevent further withdrawals and try to restore public confidence in banks. Remember, people are trying desperately to get their money out of the banks. There was no confidence in the banking or financial institutions of the United States. So this was meant to be a pause on all that and try to kind of alleviate some of the pressure on the banks and get them back into good standing. So the New Deal itself, while yes, it deals at first with banking and financial reforms, it's really composed of a variety of government programs which become known as FDR's alphabet soup because of the constant use of acronyms. You talk about the CCC, the TVA, the WPA. There's tons of different programs with different acronyms. On the other side, it's not universally praised, though. Looking back on it, obviously we see a lot of the good that it did, but ultimately at the time, there are still people who are not quite on board with the whole program. We're talking about liberals who are saying that the New Deal is not going far enough to help not only the poor, but also reform the nation's economic system. And then on the flip side, conservatives are arguing that Roosevelt's spending too much on direct relief and use policies to control business and socialize the economy. So you have the competing mindsets here, where one saying it's not going far enough, the other one saying it's going too far. So New Deal specifics, well, the economic and finance reforms were designed to increase public confidence in the banks and the economy as a whole. Right, you're talking about FDIC, which is insuring individual bank accounts up to $5,000. There's limits on how banks could act with customers' money, and then trying to make everything as transparent as all possible with stock offerings. Again, they saw what happened with the Depression. People were desperately trying to get the money, but the banks ultimately threw all their money away and invested poorly, and the stock market was just not transparent. So they're trying to make things more transparent, make sure people have confidence in the banks that they will have their money, and hopefully, overall increase more transparency, confidence, responsibility in finance and the economy as a whole. The relief for the American people designed to provide assistance for struggling farmers, general working class people, and stimulate economic recovery. Again, there's relief efforts trying to get people back to work. You're trying to provide more financial assistance. Again, just trying overall to uplift people in a variety of ways. On the other side here, agricultural measures were seeking to lower production and raise crop prices. Remember, previously, people after the war, farmers in the agricultural industry was really trying to ramp up production to sell more, but ultimately the price fell out, and then ultimately you have too much of a stockpile. They invested too much in new crops, new land, new equipment. They couldn't pay it back. This is more trying to control supply and demand and hopefully lift up the prices in the process. So again, you have economic reform, you have relief for those who are economically damaged during the Depression, you have agricultural supports, and then you're also having these gigantic infrastructure projects creating new schools, roads, bridges, dams, all to create thousands of new jobs and improve impoverished regions. Again, put people to work, invest in communities, try to jumpstart the economy. So you have some specifics here, which I'll let you guys look at, but the first one there, Tennessee Valley Authority renovated 5 dams, built 20 new ones, and provided flood control and hydroelectric power. So you're talking about gigantic projects that are employing thousands upon thousands of Americans and really trying to improve the infrastructure of the various regions. So another one down here, you'll see the CCC plants 200 million trees to prevent another Dust Bowl. Again, you're talking about massive projects that try to prevent another depression from happening. So to enact the New Deal programs, FDR and Congress had to implement a policy of deficit spending. So this is one of the first times in modern era where the government is dipping into funds that they don't necessarily have, that won't be canceled out by what the government receives in revenue. So it's spending on credit. Again, you're borrowing money that you don't necessarily have to implement these programs. All right, the government starts to accumulate debt because of this. And on the other side here, you have the Second New Deal. It's broken into different phases. The first phase and the second phase. The Second New Deal is underway by the time of the 1936 election. It's the first time that most African Americans actually voted Democratic rather than Republican, and the first time labor unions gave unified support to a candidate. So again, big shifts in how people are identifying politically. This is starting to get to where I was talking about throughout the year, where the Republicans and the Democrats kind of a shift. FDR kind of starts that, and then you'll see later on down the timeline, it really gets solidified in like the 1960s. Some more New Deal specifics. So the Second New Deal, again, it's more relief programs such as the Works Progress Administration, a revamped Agricultural Adjustment Act, a National Youth Administration, Social Security, public utilities. However, that Second New Deal and the New Deal as a whole is really having mixed results for minoritized populations, and ultimately FDR's leadership failed to support the advancement of civil rights for both African Americans and Mexican Americans. A lot of New Deal agencies and programs ultimately discriminated against both Mexican Americans and African Americans, including the NRA, the CCC, and the TVA. You're talking about inequitable wages, opportunities, and ultimately a lot of discrimination in general. So real quickly, New Deal Coalition, again, kind of continuing with that theme of politics and shifts in parties and how people are viewing themselves politically. Well, you have a really profound new occurrence where FDR, although the New Deal is not helping everybody equitably, he's still able to create a whole new alignment of diverse groups dedicated to supporting the Democratic Party and his agenda. So you're talking about bringing together Southern whites, urban groups, African Americans, and unionized industrial workers. And because of these combined support here, you're talking about Democrats dominating national politics throughout the 30s and 40s, a good solid 10 to 20 years where the Democrats are really in charge. However, things do come to an end. So you have 1937, the economy has improved enough for a lot of Americans are saying that the Depression is finally ending. Roosevelt himself is facing pressure from Congress to scale back, not to kind of continue to dip too far into deficit spending. Industrial, however, he does this, and then industrial production ultimately drops off again, and unemployment increases from 7.7 million in 37 to 10.4 million in 1938. So letting your foot off the gas in terms of economic recovery and opportunities really had a negative impact if you're thinking year to year. However, the ship's kind of sailed. The New Deal's kind of come into a close, and by 1939, it's effectively over. And this is where you're seeing a shift. You go from New Deal era to talking about World War II. So 1939 rolls around. Roosevelt is more worried and concerned over what's going on in Europe, especially in regards to Hitler's rise to power in Germany. So some lasting effects to kind of cap this off. Again, you're talking about the New Deal is a gigantic government program that really, it's unprecedented. Nothing had happened to this size and scale and magnitude in the United States in its entire history. You're talking about a government getting explicitly involved in trying to provide job opportunities, investment opportunities, reform opportunities across the board in countless different industries, regions, you name it. So you're talking about things that we still see today that have resulted in the New Deal. You're talking about the protection of workers' rights, banking and finance reforms. You remember FDIC, Social Security, gigantic means of providing financial stability for Americans. Agricultural price supports and rural electrification. And then finally, you have environmental conservation efforts, which are still around today. So some really big programs that have some really strong effects even nowadays. And then these are the last two resources. I really recommend you watch the crash course. Again, I'll put this into more perspective. And of course, a Mr. Betts New Deal parody video for your enjoyment as well. So if you have any questions, please let me know. But outside of that, thanks guys so much for tuning in to the FDR and New Deal lecture. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. And obviously, if you have any questions, please let me know.